This is Quenching Visions, stories of the other 99%, with Vova Kagan, co-founder of Sputnik Coffee, and Andrei Kolesnikov, co-founder of Steersman Company. Hi, Vova. I'm excited to have this conversation with you. I've been a fan of the Sputnik Coffee for 3 years already.
Andre, I'm happy to chat with you about it.
You and your brother run this company. You have automated lines which are behind you there. You produce a lot of coffee. You service hundreds of stores across multiple states. But how did you get started? Why did you choose coffee? How did you get on this path in the beginning?
It was more of a chance, I guess. I used to work in healthcare technology, and we would always have coffee in the office, and it was always bad. And so I brought in some equipment to make better coffee. I used to be a barista in college, and at home we would always have coffee or tea. It would, so at a certain point, it got expensive to keep bringing in all this craft coffee that everyone in the office would drink, but nobody would contribute to the pot, so to speak. Nobody would contribute to more. And a family friend just brought his own roasted coffee that he roasted in his oven to a party. And, we tried it and we're like, this isn't the best thing ever, but it's also not bad for somebody roasting in the oven. So the next day I went on eBay and found a used little home roaster, little electric roaster. And that kind of started it. And then there was another electric home roaster. And then suddenly we were tripping the breakers in my West Loop basement. And the neighbors were complaining about the smell in the stairway. And from there we kind of expanded, and it just kind of one thing led to another.
It was a hobby that went into a profession, kind of.
Yeah, and it was a kind of a shorter hobby. I mean, I've always been into coffee, and in college I had an old 1960s lever espresso machine in the dorm, so it was one of those things where I was always into it, and so was my brother, and then one thing led to another, and it quickly became more serious.
So in your family, there were expectations from the children, right? That they would go to grad school, some education type of job.
Mm-hmm.
But then you said before that when you decided on this, doing coffee, your family supported you. Your parents were supportive. They were wary but supportive. So I was wondering, could you say, how did it feel to basically say that, hey, I'm not going to grad school. I'm going to roast coffee professionally, and how did it feel to say that? How did they respond, and why do you think they responded the way they did?
I'm not sure if there was that specific kind of moment. Sometimes life just happens and things escalate, and then you forget. You miss that moment where you could have told anybody that clear thing of like, "Hey, I'm about to do this." I think we take our parents for granted, and we think that parents don't realize what's going on, and they do. And so I think part of it is we just started doing this thing, and I think my parents may have had some thoughts about what we were doing, and at the same time, there was a moment where I think they realized that I'd gotten into grad school, and but that I hadn't like sent the deposit in or hadn't like actually gotten ready for the fall semester to start. And they were like, "Hey, what are you doing? What's going on?" And they were supportive. I think there was an expectation for grad school, but at the same time, I think my parents have seen enough of in the world, in the US right now, or in any country, just having a grad school degree isn't usually enough anymore. And a lot of people go down that trap where they get a degree and expect a certain amount of immediate ROI from that degree, and it's not there. So I guess that helped, where they were like, you know what, at least they're doing something that they enjoy, and they're putting a lot of hard work towards it. So I think they saw the hard work, and therefore they were supportive. I think that's the order of operations in that case.
So they basically saw that you weren't just slacking off. It wasn't just something that you were like, I don't know, wasting your time on. You were actually serious about it, and so they wanted to let you
Yeah,
be serious about
I
it.
think the seriousness, and I think they saw that whatever would happen, it would just be a phenomenal amount of work. And so they have some experience with that in terms of on my mom's side, building out a pediatric practice. So I think part of it was like, well, let them see how much work it actually is,
I see.
and then we did.
You just kept going.
It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. They're right.
Yeah,
it's a lot of work.
but you went.
Yeah, we went. Yeah.
I see. So it feels like the real beginning of Sputnik Coffee was when you got this roaster from Ohio, right? You went and picked it up from Craigslist.
That was the first kind of crazy decision. It's like, well, I was looking for slightly upgraded home roasting equipment, and everything's pretty expensive, especially for home. So I stumbled, on Craigslist, you expand your search, and I stumbled on this commercial roaster, small for the commercial space, but still big, and the price was right, and the price was comparable to home roasters, but I didn't really think where we're going to put this. We had a friend, one of our initial partners, his basement in his 3 flat had room for this, and it had a chimney. So we're like, we'll vent it, we'll hook up 220 to make the power work. We'll connect to 110 outlets, and then we vented it through the chimney. We never thought, maybe we should bring a trailer to pick this up because it's 600 pounds. We kind of measured the back of my brother's old van, and we're like, oh, it kind of fits. And only when we got there did we realize it doesn't fit. And thankfully, the U-Haul was open for 15 more minutes. So we ran over to the U-Haul, we got a trailer, and then we had to figure out how to lift this thing 2 feet out of the trailer.
600 pounds. 2 guys?
We just lifted it, yeah. We had I think fridge. No, we didn't have any fridge moving straps. We just lifted it, which is a mistake. That's stupid. But then when we were putting in the basement of the building, then we invested in some fridge moving straps from Home Depot, and that helped a little bit.
That sounds really cool to basically go for that type of thing. I think that it's nice to have the ability to go first and actually go for it, because in reality I think that going for some kind of venture like that, there's not much downside if you're in the right time in your life, because what's the worst that could happen? Like, you're gonna waste this money on this roaster and waste your time, but then
and
go
some
back,
gas, yeah.
like,
I think we knew that as long as we could afford the piece of equipment, and as long as we knew it was at least at one point in a working condition, then we didn't have a lot to lose. And we wrongfully assumed at that time, I mean, I guess correctly, but we were like, worst case, you resell it, and you resell it in the local Chicagoland market, which has more people interested, and but at that point, I would like to say that we thought through the results of what if it didn't work, but we didn't. We were like, okay, we got this thing. Okay, now we have to hook it up. Now we have to
just make it
rewire
work.
it. Now we have to make it work. So we always think kind of, we just do it, and then the next problem comes up, and we solve the next problem.
So you basically just you were kind of all in from the beginning. You just solve the next thing, you resolve, you didn't give up.
Yes, and I guess moving forward, I would recommend that anyone going into it kind of looks at it from, well, what's the end game? I don't think we necessarily did. We were just like, well, the next problem's going to come up, we're going to solve it. But it is really good to ask yourself, does this thing actually get me close enough to where I need to be to make it a successful venture? Otherwise you end up going through several pieces of equipment, and we did, and we bootstrapped it in our own money, and that it was the only way to do it. You had to start with something that's smaller than what you really needed, and then go, next piece of equipment, etc.
Could you describe how did the first year or two go for you guys?
I think we didn't think it through, so there was a lot of learning opportunities.
Lots of challenges.
A lot of challenges. A lot of things were like, oh, we should have thought about that, So I think the one thing we realized that the city wouldn't really want anyone roasting out of a basement. That's not, you can't get that health inspected. And then we learned about a thing called zoning, where certain places in the city aren't really zoned. Even if you could make it a beautiful basement, it's not zoned for it. The city doesn't want you roasting coffee there. And then we were lucky along the way where some things lined up, and we were able to get a space 3 blocks away from where we are now. That was in very rough shape, but it let us kind of move on to the next level of, okay, how do we build this into something that can be licensed by the city, that we can welcome people, we can build out a cafe. And then from there, more challenges of like, okay, we need permits. We had a stop work order where the city inspector's like, oh, you guys have to stop. We learned how to, get an architect to do drawings, how to pull permits. We learned how many inspections we need. It's in the city of Chicago, there are a lot of things involved from point A to point B. And we learned all of them.
Yeah, I understand that you had an issue with paperwork not being submitted for a long time, and some other stuff.
Yeah, we had like an agreement with, we had an architect. The architect who was working with the landlord on other things in the building had agreed to take on our project, which at that time we thought was great, because it's really hard to find professionals that want to work on, something that's 600 square feet. Put in a couple sinks, put in a bathroom. It's not exactly, building a skyscraper. It's not interesting to a lot of professionals. So we thought it was great. And then, he had told us this was the timeline. And so we were starting to look in the city website and we're like, where's our permit? And before you get a permit, there's a whole process. So you submit your drawings and the city says, we have your information. It passes HVAC, it passes first zoning, then it passes mechanical, it passes plumbing, it passes all these things. And we weren't seeing any record of it, and at that point I started calling the Department of Buildings every day, every morning at 7 a.m. When the guy got in, I would be there. Or at least my call would be there. And at a certain point, he's like, listen, what's happening is your drawings even haven't been submitted. So there's nothing I can do until they're submitted. But he's like, this is an unrealistic, like you're in a position where you're expecting your architect to deliver something and they're not delivering that. And if they're a licensed architect in the city of Chicago, we don't want them doing that. You know what I mean? It's not like there's no one in Chicago, there's no organization that forces people to submit things on time, but it looked bad. So we called the architect. We're like, hey, here's what we found out from the Department of Buildings. And we're like, if Department of Buildings would like you to submit what you promised, so they can expedite it and they can get us the permits to build this tiny little 600 square foot cafe, because everyone wants it, right? The community wanted it. The alderman wanted it. Everybody wants a vacant property to be turned into something. Mm-hmm. And so I think that nudged him. And so he ended up doing most of the work for free because of that, because of his kind of, misrepresentation of timelines. And we learned how to do the permit process. So that was definitely like a huge challenge, because we just didn't know how. When you don't know the process, you don't even know what the first step is. You don't know who to call. So we just started calling everybody, and that kind of kept up. That's now our kind of MO. If you don't know, just call someone in the office and ask them who the other person is and who you should talk to and who can actually resolve the problem.
So what were some people that kind of really helped you in the first couple of years to get going?
I mean, I think we found, a lot of running a business in a major city is the build out, right? So like building what you need for your business. We were very lucky to meet our general contractor who at a wedding randomly who had heard that we were having trouble building out a 600 square foot cafe, which is kind of funny, right? He's like, why are you guys having trouble? You seem to be doing this the correct way. And we're like, we can't find electricians who want to do the work. We can't find plumbers we can't find anybody who wants to do the work. So he helped us, and he sent his contractors our way and told them to, price it fairly for us and do the work. And so that got us to open. And that was the first major step. And I think every little grocery store that took our coffee for the first time without knowing who we are, just based on trying it, that made a huge difference, because once you're in one store, then you go to the other store and you're like, hey, we're in that store. Mm-hmm. And so on and so forth. And then when you're in your first small local chain, you go to your next bigger chain, you're like, hey, we're in that local chain. You guys should take us. And that really, the first store that took us on really kind of moved us into a whole different playing field. But we already, that makes you in the grocery world the minute you're in one store. That's kind of what it takes. So that was extremely helpful. And we had guys help us out for free. We had guys who would work nights in another job and come and help us frame a bathroom, just because they knew that it would be hard for us to find carpenters willing to do that kind of small work. And they were really good at it. And they liked participating in the process, and they liked that we would work with them. And so at 6 a.m. I would meet a couple of guys who had just got off night shift, and they framed a bathroom, for us. So that without that, we wouldn't have been. All these little things added up to allowing us to open.
So then, in terms of your the business, how you guys developed, how did your understanding of your business evolve as you went along in the first year or first 2 years? So I understand you basically started with, you got the roaster, you started a cafe, and then you started selling to retailers. How did your understanding change, and how did you make decisions to actually modify your approach?
I think we realized that a small cafe isn't enough to actually support, to support the staff, to support people that running it. And then we decided to focus on wholesale. So the decisions were kind of made every week, being like, this week wasn't busy enough in the cafe. Instead of spending time just sitting here waiting, one of us can go out and sell more stores, and then that increased the volume of roasting that my brother was doing. And so everything kind of fed into each other, where fed into it. So we got to the point where we had landed large imperfect produce order, because we had a bunch of mislabeled bags, and we'd reached out to them. We're like, hey, we have these mislabeled bags, and maybe, instead of just tossing them, we can do something with you. And they liked the coffee. They really liked the blend. They liked that it was kind of a one style, one medium roast that worked in their system. And they were at a gap between coffee providers. So they were like, we'll take you. And suddenly you're talking about 24,000 units, and then we realized that we couldn't roast really enough. So then we started looking around, like, where can we find something larger from our 5 kilos? So we went up to a 15 kilo. We were looking for a 15 kilo, and we got lucky. We met this guy named Victor Allen, who restored old German roasters. And at that time, he actually recommended that we look at this younger Italian company that's doing something different, where their roasters are more environmentally friendly. We wouldn't need an afterburner, and it would allow us to have kind of continuous production. We wouldn't have to wait for the equipment to cool down or warm up. Everything was made for nonstop for roasting. When the minute we turned on that roaster, we could roast as much coffee as we needed to. And he introduced us to them. Unfortunately, he passed away right before we got the equipment going. But he left us in good hands with the two guys who took over his company. And that then we were in a 15 kilo, and then we're like, okay, we need even more stores to keep this roaster busy. And that kind of triggered even more wholesale. So it was kind of one of these, one step leads to another.
So it's an interesting thing where a screw up was actually something that really opened the gates in a way, right? Because of mislabeled items. It's a chance almost.
There are things that end up turning out to be like, okay, either that delay led to enough time to actually pull something off, or mislabeled bags lead to a sales opportunity. There's definitely, my brother says I'm too much of an optimist. He's probably right, but
you got to keep your eyes open.
And at the end of the day, you have the situation in front of you, so it doesn't really matter what you think. It doesn't really matter how you look at it. What matters is the next what you do,
what you do with it. Of course.
Exactly.
So how were your days like back then? When you got this 15 kilo roaster, you guys were scrambling. You still had a cafe to roast and then sell and deliver.
That once we had that roasting capacity, it was a larger machine in a small space. Everything got a little
feet, right?
600
for a
square
cafe
feet
and the roaster.
Yeah, and it was right before COVID, so the minute COVID hit, we closed off seating, so all we had in front of the cafe were pallets of storage, and then we bought a sprinter, and we used the sprinter for storage of green coffee. So it was like a mini warehouse. So when we had orders, it was kind of crazy, because you're roasting in back, you're walking these boxes up to the front, you're building the pallet in front, and then at the end of the day, you're walking the pallet out to your sprinter, rebuilding it, then wrapping it, then getting it to the distributor. So it was a bunch of, I think we calculated we lifted a box 8 times before it got to where it needed to go, and we're like, this is not sustainable. We can't do this. At a certain point, sure, you could hire people to do it, but we never like to hire for just a repetitive task. If there's a way to improve that task fundamentally, or change how the process is done, we'd rather do that than just hire someone as a band-aid to just do it.
Right, because I guess in a way, if you hire band-aids like that, then you never have the money to invest into some automation, right? Because you eat all the money.
Yes, it becomes expensive from that perspective, and then you kind of lose sight of why you want to do that. But if you do it yourself, then you're constantly reminded every day, every large order that comes in, you're like, we promised ourselves we'd improve this, and it keeps you honest.
I understand that you started as 4 partners, right? And then, well, I think it's a natural thing that effort or commitment from different people would be quite different. Did you guys have challenges in the partnership, and how did you guys resolve these things?
Yeah, there were definitely challenges. I think we did have weekly meetings where we try to all sit down and talk things through, and see how things are going. I think the one thing we would have done differently is you see it all the time, but nobody ever follows the advice of set actual job descriptions, make everything super clear right from the beginning, because the minute you're starting, the minute you have other problems you're dealing with, sometimes those personal matters and how people work together goes to the back burner. It's important. It's very important, but it's suddenly become, it's maybe less important than fulfilling a distributor order, um, so we definitely have challenges where I think you go into something thinking that everyone's like you. We grow up necessarily with this worldview that everyone's kind of like us, maybe a little different, but generally. But then you realize that people have their strengths, their weaknesses, and sometimes the way they approach the world is very different from you. The way they approach problems is very different. Not better, not worse. It might have the same outcome, but it becomes very difficult if
It
you
might be
don't have.
incompatible.
Right. It might be incompatible, or it might be incompatible without significant
Friction.
friction or significant you have to compartmentalize it, or you have to work separately, or there are different strategies that a lot of people use. I've known executives to be in two different cities intentionally, not intentionally, but you know what I mean, but almost intentionally, because it's better not to have them in the same room. We were in a 600 square foot cafe, so
Yeah.
that was a little different, and especially with my twin brother, we're family. We can say a lot of things without saying them necessarily, and we also had to make sure that we were translating our conversations effectively to everybody else, because they don't have our, you know what I mean, they don't have our necessary, they don't see each other outside of work as much as we would. So there were challenges, and I think everybody went on to something that they wanted to do more, and this was some of the things were kind of, you end up leaning into the things that you're good at and the things you want to do. And so we happen to like some of this equipment. We liked rebuilding equipment, we liked finding the right piece of equipment, we liked the roasting process, we loved kind of the whole grind. We love seeing the raw product. We love seeing raw green coffee being roasted. It never gets old, and I think that's why we stayed with it. And I think um, our other partners went into things that fulfilled them more so, and so that's kind of how it went.
So would you have done something different? Would you still partner up?
You know, I don't know. I do tell people all the time to be really clear about why they're looking for a partner, and I think helps you and it helps the partner to have those dynamics of, like, someone there just to be your investment. Okay, then if so, when are they going to get their money back? And it's not a really sexy thing to talk about, but to clear timelines, and I think we would have had more clear understanding, and maybe we wouldn't have. I think we would have just tried maybe it as just us, just a family, and who knows, the company may be completely different than it is now.
Right.
Maybe we wouldn't have survived without that extra help. Maybe we would have. I really don't know. We don't think back to it too much, but I always, moving forward, I always tell people when they're like, well, I'm going to partner with these three people, and I'm like, okay, you're going to be married to three people. That's kind of what, and someone told me that before we started the company, and I didn't listen to them.
Yeah, I think it's a very common story. Everybody that had some issues, they know after they had them, but all the people that, well, not all the people, but many people that start, they get told that, but they don't really hear it. The specific things that need to be done ahead of time.
Yeah, and if you I think maybe one of the things you said in the beginning, if you start a business at the point where you don't have a lot to lose, it might be better, because you're going to have to go through all these things on your own. There's only so much you can learn from reading, or from any from absorbing. You have to do it. You have to make the mistake. So it's nice to make that mistake in your 20s, or make any mistake in your 20s, and not necessarily in your 50s when you're gambling your life savings, and then the tensions get a little
Well, I
different.
guess maybe even 50s are a little bit easier, right? But like
Mhm.
probably like 30s, 40s, when you have children that
Yeah.
are growing up and you have commitments,
You have
that
responsibilities, you
yeah.
have financial strain. It's a
Yeah.
different animal. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. We're lucky we started everything a little earlier.
For the first few years, did you guys make some costly mistakes that maybe you could share? Something that either cost some money or spent a lot of time that you guys shouldn't have spent on.
Yeah, I think it all our world is really equipment focused. So we definitely, bought, we try to set up, we try to fulfill all of our clients' demands, or they're like, oh, I want you to get this piece of equipment for us, and we finance it, so we're like, oh yeah, we'll lease espresso equipment to places, but sometimes people wouldn't pay, and then Grisha got in a situation where he had to go repo a machine,
Mhm.
and almost had the cops called on him, and it was our espresso machine, but we were like, we stepped back and we're like, why are we spending our cash financing somebody else's thing? So we changed our strategy, and we're like, if you want our coffee, we're kind of a no frills company. You get your own equipment. You do what you need to do, get used, do whatever it takes, and then we'll help you. We'll help you set it up. We'll help you maintain it. We'll support you, but we won't do it for you. We won't rebuild machines for people. We won't service them in the middle of the night. That's just not our specialty. So we definitely have some skeletons of coffee machines that have either been destroyed because they were at a place that didn't care for them, or we never got around to rebuilding them. And then you realize that's money down the drain. Uh, we've also purchased equipment thinking that we can make it work for the thing we needed to, and then we realized we're not engineers. We can rebuild something if it's supposed to work for that thing you're using it for, but we're not talented enough to machine new
Repurpose.
parts and repurpose. It's not our thing, and paying somebody to do that, you might as well buy the newer equipment or the correct piece of equipment.
Right. You also did. I think you told me before that you tried doing a cold brew.
We learned that there's a right scale for everything, and there's a right scale as much as you can. Obviously, we're never going to be at the scale of Coca-Cola or something like that. But we built out a 900 square foot cold brew bottling facility. With a pasteurizer, with bottling equipment, we put quite a bit of money into that space. Thankfully, we still have that equipment, but it was 2 years of really long hours on top of running the cafe and roasting to then travel to this other facility, which was only 4 or 5 miles away, which isn't that far. But that's, 30 minutes there, 40 minutes there, 40 minutes back. You forget something, okay, 40 minutes there, 40 minutes back. And we realized that we can't really run in two different facilities. The way we run the company and our processes, there are a lot of companies that run multiple facilities. We're not one. We don't have the technology for it. We don't have the organization for it. So that helped that I guess any time wasted doing that helped us realize that we need to be in one space, and we need the right square footage for what we want to do. Even if it looks like too much in the beginning, it's better to have a little too much in the beginning than to try to create something in too small of a space.
So is that kind of one of the, I guess, does that lead up to this idea that you had that you were going to do ground coffee,
Mm-hmm.
and then you you planned it kind of, you backed into what you needed, right? So basically, you were like, okay, we're going to do ground coffee. We need this capacity. We need this machinery. That means we need this space. We need a building.
Mm-hmm. We wanted to do ground. All the grocery stores from the beginning were like, okay, you have whole bean, it's selling really well. We want to see your blend and your medium roast ground. And a lot of places just put ground coffee in a bag, and that's fine. But what we found is when we tested those products on the shelf, we were always disappointed at the freshness. The ground coffee does lose its freshness faster, so you have to preserve it. There are different ways to do that. We decided to go the vacuum packaging route to take out 99.9% of the oxygen and to prevent any of those staling reactions from happening in the first place. But you're right, we backed into it. We were like, well, what do we need to do this? What kind of equipment do we need? How long is the line? How much space does it take up? How much coffee do we have to roast to even run this equipment at the right speed? And then we kind of backed into it, and we quickly realized we needed 10 to 15,000 square feet. That was the number we came up for, because you also want space for pallet jacks. You want space for a forklift. You don't want to be lifting by hand anymore. You don't want to set anyone up for injury. You want to do things the right way to make it safe. You want to produce at scale, but produce safely.
From this time when you decided that you needed this, you needed to expand, needed another building, until the time you actually moved in here.
Mhm.
We are in the building now. How long did it take, and how were your days like? Because you were at that point, then you had a cafe, then you were roasting, selling, and then I guess you were still doing cold brew at some point there, and you
We
also were working on construction permits, all these things.
Yeah.
It seems like not enough hours in a day.
There weren't. I believe that sometimes having too much work focuses you on what needs to be done. There are definitely things that were dropped. I think took from getting into this building about 3.5 years since the idea formed in our head, where we had some conversations with my brother and I. Were like, well, what's sustainable? What really needs to happen to make a business that can support its staff, support its owners, make great coffee, but at the same time not require working 16 to 18 hours a day. that's not, I mean, we spent at the cold brew space, we were there 23 hours some days, for huge production runs. That's not sustainable. You can't do that. And then from then, it kind of, we were finishing up in the cold brew space. So we would, uh, have meetings with the real estate agent, then quickly drive over, do whatever we had to do before the next cold brew production run at the other space. And there were times where we missed things. We there were buildings that we couldn't look at because we could never get the timing right. And so thankfully, at that point we made a decision to quickly step out of that other space. We were lucky that someone was ready to take that space over, so we didn't have to get out of a lease. We didn't have to fulfill the remainder of the lease obligation. We were able to get out. That freed up time, and all that freed up time went to looking at buildings, figuring out how to finance it, how to make it happen. But I think we were very naive, and we thought it would take like 6 to 8 months, from looking at a place to opening in it, and it took 3.5 years.
And then I believe you also told me when you were looking for the building, you had one case where you got lucky. You were looking at it, and then, well, lucky in the sense that you found out there was 8 feet of standing water in the basement for years,
Oh
and
yeah,
it wasn't even listed. So you saw some bizarre
we had a
real
we had a
estate.
really tight budget. We had a really tight budget, and at that time, our real estate agent was like, "Well, if you see a building that's vacant or empty, you can always try to call the owner and see if they'd be willing to sell to you. But when you're trying to look at commercial real estate in Chicago, and your budget is like $500,000, you're going to be looking at some interesting buildings. And so one of the buildings, as you mentioned, it was further away from our current location, further than we wanted to be. And then, the building itself looked normal. There were definitely issues with the roof, and then they were using it for car storage. And so one of the people storing their car there was like, guys, since the owner's not here, let me show you something. And so we go around back, and there's a smell of like just mildew, and then he opens the stairwell, and you just see water. It looks like one of those scenes from a recent flood. And I'm like, is that recent? I don't remember any rain. He's like, it's been like that for 4 or 5 years since I've been here. And we are like, okay. And we just walked away. No, we're like, it's not even worth talking about this. It's not even worth negotiating, because you never know the kind of damage that's underneath. We saw buildings without a roof, where the owner would be like, well, I can put it on a roof. And I'm like, a roof should come with a building. A building needs a roof. And especially a lot of people hold on to real estate for investment purposes just to wait out change. And we couldn't really bargain with them. We couldn't offer them, we couldn't afford to buy those places. So we were really lucky that we had initially looked at this place, and then we just thought we weren't really sure about where it was. Like, we couldn't visualize where it was until we drove past it one day, and we're like, okay, actually this could be the spot. It's close enough. And once we toured the inside, we were scared a little bit. There was a lot of issues. The roof was leaking. There were definitely a lot of structural issues to the building, and the city wanted to demo it. So if we didn't buy the building and we didn't rehab it fully, it would have probably been gone by now. It would probably be an empty lot.
So any suggestions for others if you're trying to find a commercial space, a real estate, right, to purchase something for a small
Yeah.
business? Any ideas how to
I would say
approach
that
this?
you have to be really specific with what you need, the size. You have to be really clear with what you can buy it for, what your financing is, and how you're going to remodel it, because everyone's going to ask. When you go for bank financing, they're not going to finance a building that you need to rehab without seeing an actual plan. And it's kind of one thing, you don't really want to invest time in an architect or getting your contractors out to every single building. But at the same time, nobody will take you seriously if you don't have a plan for the building you're trying to get financing for. So I would recommend that people, even if it's their general contractor, or even it's someone they know that's in construction, bring them along. Ask them to look into the corners, look underneath, look into the basement, look into the plumbing, look into everything to see, is there something in here that's really scary and really expensive to fix.
So bring an inspector with you.
You could bring a licensed inspector, but you almost, as close to as good of an inspector as you can get. Bring them along. If you trust them and they're on your side, then they're going to tell you a lot of things that are wrong that you just might miss.
for when you actually got the building already, it was still over 2 years, from what I understand, to actually go from the point where you got the building until you
Yeah.
moved in, right?
Yeah, we closed in May of 2022
Right.
and we moved in October of 2024.
So the process was basically that you got the permits, right?
Mhm.
You even got a grant for the building. You got a TIF grant, you told me, right?
Yeah.
And then, well, but there was you later found out that it maybe wasn't really the best option, but you got that type of grant,
Yeah,
right?
we definitely we won the grant and then we closed on the building.
Hmm.
And then we started the process of well how do we get money from the city? Like how do we get the help that was promised, you know? We realized that closing on a Chicago grant is very complicated and you're entering in this many year partnership with the city and it's a really long document. You're develop, and they're treating you as if you're. It's the same documentation as if you're a developer that's developing 100-story, building with city help or with Cook County help. It's the same process. It's the same paperwork, and we were a really small project to be taking on that level of paperwork, and we were really lucky to have support from our lawyer. He was great. He kind of took this on as I'm going to help you close on this because you need to close on it so you can at least start the process of getting paid because you don't. I think people think that whenever they win a grant, that's it, money in their pocket, and that's not. It may take a year, it may take 2 years, and there's still people who've won the same grant we have won who have not seen any payment. So closing on this grant became kind of almost my not full time job, but definitely close to full time job, and then getting paid from the city was also a full time job. And then we realized that the way the grant was written was we were told that we could start construction right away. So we were eager and we're like, yeah, let's get the bulldozers in, let's demo, let's start work, and we'll pay the guys, cash, or not cash, but like we'll pay them to start work while we wait for the grant to open up. We didn't realize that by starting the work, we basically made it so that we could never set up an escrow with the city. We were too far in. And at the same time, the minute you start work, no bank's going to give you financing anymore because it becomes complicated figuring out who you paid correctly, who didn't you, who has a lien, who doesn't have a lien, who can file a lien. And so a lot of banks want you not to start anything until you're closed with them. Same with the city. So we got ourselves in a position where we thought, we would have to complete 30% of the full project before we even saw a dollar. And then in closing our grant, there was a paperwork mistake, just a typo that led to that 30% suddenly becoming 90%. So we realized at one point, and it was a pretty sobering realization that we would have to complete almost $2 million of work with the acquisition, with the equipment, before we ever saw any payment from the city grant.
And then I believe you told me before that 30 banks rejected you until the what
Yeah.
is it, Chicago Community Loan Fund
Yeah.
finally gave you something. You also exhausted all your family savings.
Yeah.
It was
When you have
bad.
to, because we want to keep moving forward with construction. So, contractors would start, and a lot of our contractors were incredibly flexible with their terms, but still at a certain point they needed to get paid so they could pay their guys. We were able to secure a machinery loan with one bank, Devon Bank, but because we had started on the construction, they didn't want to move forward on they didn't want to take on the construction part too. They were supposed to bundle it, but they didn't want to because they're like, well, you're a third of the way done. We don't know who you paid. We don't know. It's too complicated, too risky. So at that point, I started calling other banks. I would call real estate hedge funds. I would call the lawyers who represent real estate hedge funds, pretty large funds that develop in Chicago. And I would just cold call them, and they're like, "Why are you calling?" And I'm like, "Well, we have this project. We have guaranteed funding from the city. We just need a bridge. It's a great investment, right? You know the city's going to pay you back. You just need $1 million to like get to that first check." And then turns out that for a lot of these funds, or for a lot of any funds that even specifically work with TIF money and specifically work with low income housing and everything you would think would help with this project, it would take 50 grand to 100 grand of due diligence just for them to close. And I'm like, and a lot of them were like, we'll talk to you, but do you want to give up 10% of your grant just in due diligence? Because they're used to working on 10, 20, $50 million projects where, okay, 100 grand isn't, in due diligence is normal. But for us, that would be a significant cut into the grant. And we just kept calling bank after bank, and one bank kind of went, one community loan fund, not CCLF, but another one went. We went pretty far with them, and then they just they were in Chicago and New York, and someone on the New York board of directors didn't like the project, or they wanted to steer focus away from Chicago. And so we were caught in, it's a good they think it's a good project, but the organization's focus is somewhere else. It's kind of also kind of a scary thought that you could do everything right, you could prepare all your documents right, and the organization that you need to support you might, look at other things that year just because, and they're still supporting great projects over there, just not your project here, which you need. And then we talked to CCLF, and at that point, I think a lot of the phone calls I had reached their ears, where they had heard that we were, talking. And some, it turns out some of our subscribers to our 5 pound bags online worked for either architectural companies that worked with TIF lenders, or they worked with consulting companies that consulted on low income housing in Chicago or community driven projects. And they helped with introduction letters to CCLF. So kind of like everything came together in this really, we were really lucky that, and then CCLF, we didn't hear from them for like 3 to 4 weeks, and we're like, okay, we're really done. We're really done. I mean, that once you've exhausted them, no one's going to lend to you. And then they came back and they're like, okay, we'd like a site visit, and we'd like to start the closing process. Here's a closing officer. This is how it's going to happen. And that was a breath of fresh. That was our first real relief.
I think that I've had my share of sleepless nights over my business. Well, when you know when we were starting out for the first few years, it was hard financially. So there would be a time when I'm not sure how we're going to meet payroll, or how we're going to pay taxes, or I don't know what's worse, payroll or taxes.
Right.
And then we also had some partnership problems where it got really bad, and it was very stressful. But I think this kind of tops it. But how did you then? How did you keep your sanity? Or do you dye your hair? Is your hair actually all gray?
No, my hair is still
No?
gray. It's definitely gotten more gray. My brother's too.
Okay.
I think our sanity, uh, we're very lucky to we have a great family, great group of friends. So things normal, we try to keep normal things in life normal. We would hang out, we would try to not to cancel on friends. We try to make as many commitments as possible to retain some normalcy. You need some time away from the craziness. But at the same time, I think we were doing a lot of management of the construction side. So, which is a crazy amount of work because we're not experienced general contractors at all, So we would work during the morning, and I would leave the cafe mid-morning, head over here. It's not far, 3-4 blocks. Meet with contractors, find out, okay, what materials are we missing for tomorrow? Okay, do we need a Home Depot run? Do we need a supply run? What do we need to keep these guys working? And then my brother would come at the end of the day at the shop, and then we would solve other problems. And I think the day-to-day grind of what's the next problem? What does the next contractor need? How do we get the electrician what we need? How do we get the plumber what he needs? How do we move, keep the construction timeline going? That level of distraction kept the craziness at bay, because when there were days where nobody was working in here for some reason, and you were just walking an empty building,
That's when you have to think about it. Well,
the thoughts start to get a little scary, especially you're in a dark building, and you're like, how is this going to turn into what we need it to? How is this going to be inspected by the city? How are we going to fix this problem? That got scary. So luckily we kept ourselves busy with other things.
how did moving from the 600 square foot shop to a 15,000 square foot shop, and then also starting the ground coffee production, which is a lot more complex. There are more moving parts in there. How do you think that changed you and your business?
I think, it was definitely a learning process, and I think we quickly realized that the way we do work over there doesn't translate to over here. It's a completely different animal. It's a completely different space, and especially any product that is harder than just putting beans in a bag and sealing it. Anything that requires, you have to plan ahead, and you have to really be honest with yourself if your equipment and if the way you set it up it works. And there were times where my brother and I would look at each other halfway through a production run. Where we're doing the run with our production staff, and we're like, this doesn't work, and or it's this machine doesn't work. We had issues where some of the equipment, even though we told the equipment rebuilder that like we're 208 in this building, well, some of the equipment still had a 240 transformer. So we thought we were really going crazy, where every single relay, every single electrical component in that machine was going crazy. We were changing the settings correctly. We were dialing everything in. And then, you know, the numbers, like the timer would just start to go haywire. And we're like, what's going on? And so thankfully, we have a pretty good network of guys that we can call who pro bono talk us through electric issues and controls issues and some of the automation issues with this equipment. And one of them was like, hey, what transformer do you have? We're like, I don't know, it says 240. Why does it say 240? We need 208. And he's like, just get another transformer, buy this one. And we bought it, we put it on ourselves. He guided us through the wiring. Because again, if you hire a real controls person, have them come out just to rewire this transformer, it could easily be several $1,000s of their time and work, and rightfully so. But that would mean that the equipment we bought, we should have just bought new, once you factor in those costs. So we were able to get it working the next day, and we're like, okay, this is how it's supposed to work. Suddenly everything becomes smoother. And then you move on to the next bottleneck. Okay, what other equipment's not working? And so it is a big realization that when you move to the next phase in your business, it's kind of scary that you can use some of the things you've learned, but not everything translates to the next phase of growth.
Besides the four of you original partners that started the company, then I guess you mentioned that a bunch of people helped you.
Mm-hmm.
Who do you think were some people without whom this wouldn't have been here?
I mean, I'm going to say our general contractor again, just because the building part, without him trusting us with the project, and without him making sure his contractors were working with us, and without him navigating, it's his license at stake. At the same time, we had help from a lot of professionals in the coffee industry. I mean, even the other day, we were trying to look at buying a much larger industrial grinder, and we were able to call a much bigger coffee company in Wisconsin that we have a 60 kilo behind me. They have two 120s. So they have 240 kilos of roasting capacity every 15 minutes, And when I call him, he picks up the phone, and we can talk through any equipment. So they're really great. And then I have to say we've had some advisors business advisors who have continuously helped when you think you're crazy. It's nice to call, especially in the beginning when things are really tough. You need to wait it out sometimes. Sometimes you need to change course, but sometimes you just need to wait it out. And we were able to call them. And, some of them were former executives of, Kraft, for example. And hearing from someone who used to run the Maxwell House brand that, hey, you guys are on the right track, keep going, is really refreshing. And it helps kind of push aside the scary thoughts to let you move on to the next problem you have to solve.
Yeah, I guess in the beginning there are times when you start questioning whether this is sanity or
right.
not, right?
Or if you're doing the right thing, if you're in the right space, are you in the right area, are you in the right building? Is this, you know what I mean? It becomes kind of it could be nonstop.
So then, for all your ups and downs, what do you think led to your successes?
I mean, I think we have a lot of ways to go before we can label ourselves as
that's why I'm saying
successful.
Successes, the individual instances.
Yeah, I think everything has come down to if you do the work, if you're trying to sell a product, and we're trying to get coffee into more grocery stores, if you keep the conversations alive with the buyers, you do the sales work. If your product's good, like I have full faith in how my brother roasts and everything quality wise, and so that lets me go sell the product. And we've had things that they were 3-year sales cycles, and I'm not a professional sales guy. I don't have a CRM. We don't really do it, but every once in a while I would touch base, with a buyer, and 3 years later they'd be like, oh, we want to take you on, and it could be, and maybe it wasn't my sales. Maybe it was the fact that they had an opening on their shelf, or that they want to prioritize local that year. You can't control that, but you at least could control your relationship with that person. And so any success we've had has come from just continuing to be present and being there, and trying to be ready for the opportunity when it comes.
How do you feel entrepreneurship affected your life and your personal relationships and things like that? Or perhaps actually, maybe it's not that entrepreneurship affected your life and relationship. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's your personality that put you on a path of entrepreneurship that did that. And then in that case, how do you feel that what does it give you that's positive and maybe also handicaps in terms of your personal stuff?
I think our friends and family have been really, and my girlfriend, everyone's been really patient and supportive. You know, we show up. We There were times where we showed up late or pretty dirty from construction to family events or to friends' parties, and everyone's been, really understanding. I do think we both my brother and I probably have different personalities than the traditional 9 to 5 that would work in the traditional 9 to 5. So doing this has let us kind of channel our creativity and craziness during the day at work when we don't have to disrupt our friends with it. And so now when we're home, I think this craziness has led to the fact that I've realized when I'm home, I just want to open a book and read, or grill with friends, or cook dinner with friends. And sure, cooking is work, but it's not. For me, it's not. And when you have to do so much purchasing and evaluating for your work, I don't online shop anymore. I don't need, you kind of, our job kind of takes all that out of you, where we've maintained sanity by at home. We just focus on being home, being present, and trying to relax as much as possible before the next day. So I'm a real believer in. I think everyone should find something that allows their creativity to flow through in their day, and their craziness to be kind of a benefit throughout whatever they're doing their day. So the rest of the time they can be themselves.
It's a good way to approach it, I think.
It's kept us, and we're not perfect, but I think it's kept us reasonably healthy and in good spirits throughout this whatever 7 8 years of craziness.
Well, I think that a huge factor is also that the people around you support you, and I'm guessing that's kind of the way that it kind of works is that people that don't really things just drift apart. You no longer interact with them, right?
You do start to the minute you have less time, whether if you have kids from
Mhm.
you recently have kids or something, anytime some constraint gets placed on your time, you become really understanding of how important that your time is. And so we've definitely focused our time on closer friends,
Yeah,
on the people that really matter. And sure, you try to see everybody, but you just can't.
yeah.
You can't. So we've definitely focused on the things that matter.
I had maybe a similar experience when we were, well, now still and before too. So I went through different cycles basically where when we started, uh, didn't really have a lot of money because we were starting out, so finances were really tight. And then, so friends would go out and they would invite me and I would just never go because, I can't afford
Hmm.
to, or I'm
Yeah,
tired or something like this.
yeah.
And so then little by little, people stop inviting,
Hmm.
and then I'm doing better now, but now it's time and kids, so it's like with some of the older friends that we used to hang out with all the time, now we barely see each other.
Well, you have different priorities, right? And
Yeah.
and um and I think there are people who stick around
Yep.
who then you realize that maybe, yeah, you like to go out with them, but then their lives change and you change with them.
Mhm.
Or just you try everything you can to meet up with them once a month. And
Yep.
when you do meet up, it's great. And that's just the way it is. And then I'm lucky to have a group of friends that I get to see multiple times a week. It's a small group, but
Mhm.
it keeps me sane. Um, we get together for workouts once a week and we cook dinner. And as funny as that sounds, that's enough to keep me sane. I think it keeps all of us sane. I think it helps
Yeah,
everybody.
it's a big thing to do something like that together for no real reason other than just to be together and hang out, right?
Yeah, and,
It's
and
nice.
you realize that the people you don't have to impress anybody. The people who have been with you, they're just, their thing is like, if you can make it. If you can't, we're not gonna pressure you. We're not gonna make you feel bad about it. Just try. And we usually, even if we show up late, even if we barely make it to the last hour of a hangout, we'll still try to be there. We try not to let work get in the way. Unfortunately, it's still a lot of hours, and so we're trying to figure out ways to do things more efficiently, do things better, but it doesn't happen overnight.
Thank you so much for sharing these insights. It was very interesting, and once again, it's been exciting for me to learn more about you, considering that I've been using your product for a few years, and so it's nice to know the person
The
that's
background.
behind it.
And thank you for being a supporter, and thank you for having me on this podcast. It's fun.